Welcome back, fellow students of the Bible. It's good to be with you again and to have a chance to discuss Lesson 6 of our Bible Correspondence course, The Law and the Christian. This lesson is on the basics. In the last lesson, we went to some pains to establish the whole idea behind law, because it seems to me that many people run off and at the deep end. They get confused about the law. Their arguments that they advance relative to whether they keep the law or don't keep the law are really based on wrong concepts about why God gave it to man in the first place. And we saw that the law grows out of the way things are, that because it hurts man to do things a certain way, God gave him a law that says, thou shalt not do this. And that the whole idea behind the laws, we're going to see this time, even in the definitions of law, are that the law is a teacher. It's there to help a man to understand the difference between right and wrong, and that this is conduct that's good for you, and this is conduct that's not good for you. There's an unfortunate tendency among many people to make the law into sort of an idol of itself, that it is the ultimate standard, but they're thinking of it as an arbitrary standard imposed by God, that he could just as easily have said, don't do it this way, as he said, do it this way. And in truth, the law of God is laid out to give us the best of all possible worlds, to show us how to live a life, how to love God, and how to love our fellow man. I won't review on the tape the definitions of law and the introduction to this lesson, but I think it might be a good idea if you refreshed your memory on it before you can continue studying with us on this tape. But otherwise, we're going to jump right into the questions and answers and the scriptures, the passages of scriptures that are brought out in this particular lesson. The first one is Matthew 5 and verse 17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law of the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all has come to pass. Whoever therefore shall break one of the least of these commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven. You're going to have to do a whole lot better, he said, than these guys have done. They have chased the law, and funny, they were very diligent about the law. At least they seem to be diligent about the law. And yet Jesus says you're going to have to do and reach a higher standard than that. Now, what did he mean by that, and how are we to understand all this? Well, turning now to the lesson, question number 1, does Jesus seem to feel that people are likely to mistake what he is saying about the law? Well, yeah, he does. Because as he's going to proceed in the Sermon on the Mount, he's going to tell them things about the law that are different from what they have been told up until this time. But along with the written law, the Ten Commandments, the statutes, and the judgments that are all written down in the Old Testament, there was a vast body of oral law that had come into existence. Jesus will refer to it as the tradition of the elders or the tradition of the fathers, or they are the traditions of the Jewish people. These are the oral law that were passed down from generation that really have to do with human judgments and human traditions based upon the law that the Jews had developed. Now, Jesus is going to take great exception with the oral law, but he is not going to take exception with the written law, and that's why he comes through with his, look, don't think I'm come to destroy the law. Not one jot nor one tittle. Now, these are references to written law. These are references to the punctuation marks, the things that you actually put down on parchment in the process of writing a law. He said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from that till everything has come to pass. So don't think, in all the things I'm going to be saying to you in the rest of this sermon, that I have come to abolish, do away with, diminish the written law. Nothing of the kind is going to happen till heaven and earth have passed. Now, question number 2. What were they likely to think that he did not want them to think? Well, they were going to think he was doing away with the law. Number 3, what might Jesus have meant when he said he came not to destroy, but to fulfill? Well, you think about this, there are a number of things you could put down, but I referred you particularly to Matthew 13:48, where the same Greek word for fulfill or fill up has to do with a net full of fish. So that the idea that what Jesus is doing is filling up the law. And in a sense, as he sets out, and we'll talk about this much more in the next lesson of the correspondence course than we will in this one, He proceeds as a teacher of the law to fill up the law in the sense of understanding of areas that the old law never really addressed and did not address adequately, and left loopholes, if you will, in it for the carnal mind to walk through. Just as a quick example, he said, "You've heard it said by them of old time, you shall not commit adultery." But I'm going to tell you more than that. I'm going to tell you that if you look upon a woman to lust after her in your heart, you have already committed adultery. Whatever harm there is to be done, you've done it. The change in your mind, the change in your heart, you've actually done this thing in your heart of hearts. When you look upon a woman, this fills up the law, fills out the law, makes the law more understandable, more a matter of the heart and the intent than the Jews had recognized it to be. I say the Jews, I basically mean the people in and around Jerusalem, the Pharisees in particular, had recognized it to be. This is not to say, by the way, folks, that 100 years before Jesus spoke these words, that you did not do any harm to yourself by looking upon a woman to lust after her. We do understand that, I hope. That what he is doing is filling up our understanding. The law itself has always been there, and Jesus isn't changing a thing. Now, verse number 4, if Jesus did not come to destroy the law, what part of the law might we expect to survive his ministry? Well, all of it, wouldn't we? At least all of the written law. Now, the oral law may take a battering in the process, but the written law would survive it. At what point in time, number 5, will it become possible for the smallest punctuation of the law to pass away? Well, he said until heaven and earth pass, and I think that's rather interesting because so much of the law has to do with the way the physical creation works. And man's a part of the physical creation. You know, we're here. So as long as there is a physical creation and man is here, the law is here. That's not that hard. Now, number 6 is verse 18 listing 2 conditions for the law to pass away, or just one? In other words, is it an either or? Actually, it lists 2 conditions very plainly. And number 7, if there are 2 conditions, does only one of them have to prevail for the law to pass away, or do both of them have to prevail? Well, I have an elaborate explanation of this in the course. I won't go into it here, but it's very plain from the way it's constructed that both of these things have to take place before the law can pass away. Until heaven and earth had passed away, if they're still here, go outside and look around, folks. If heaven and earth are still here, not one jot, not one tittle of the law has passed away. And the logic behind it is so simple. It is that the law of God, as revealed to man and for man, is based on the physical creation. It's based upon the way things are. It's based upon the way human beings interact, and the way, not only with one another, but the way they interact with their environment, because many of the laws had to do with environment and conservation. Number 8, did Jesus then consider it permissible to break one of the least of all the commandments? Well, plainly, in the latter verses of this, he makes it clear that the answer is no. Now, this does pose a problem. Does this mean that modern man has an obligation to keep even the most obscure of Old Testament laws? Well, at first blush, it seems like a difficult question, and a lot of people, when you present this and say, no, the law hasn't passed away, they'll say, okay, fine. Then they'll cite some obscure Old Testament law and say, you still do this? And you'll have to kind of hang your head and drag your toe in the dirt and say, well, no, I don't do that. Well, if you don't do that, why do you do any of it? Well, we're going to talk about that because it's an important question. It deserves an answer. The next heading is Deuteronomy 17, verses 8 through 13. I won't read them all because I almost ran over one of these tapes not long ago, and I don't want to do that on this occasion. In the nature of things, question number 9. Is it possible to write a law that will cover every variation of human conduct? Well, now, common sense tells you that it is impossible to do that. By the time you get down to all the nuances and, well, what if this is true, and what if that's true, and what if he doesn't do this, and what if she does that? Oh my, the permutations of it are endless. If you're a Sabbath keeper, for example, you know that the laws in the Old Testament and the Bible at large, and even Jesus' explanations of the Sabbath in the New Testament, really are pretty sparse compared to the life situations and questions and challenges you can encounter relative to the Sabbath day. And, even with generalities having been made, somebody will ask, well, should you wash dishes after a meal on the Sabbath day? And someone will say, no, you should leave them in the sink. Well, can I wash one cup and saucer, just rinse them out after I've had my coffee or my tea? They said, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. Oh, okay. Well, then, if one, why not two? And if two, why not three? And if three, why not four? And if four, why not 40? And you see the problem that people get into. So it's really not possible to write a law that covers every variation of human conduct. Number 10, is a man likely to have to make judgments relative to any given law? Well, yeah, he is. When you finish that, you're sitting at your breakfast table, looking out the window at the morning on the Sabbath, and you've got to decide, shall I wash this cup, or shall I just put it in the sink and leave it? There's nothing in the Bible to tell you that. You basically have to decide. It's a matter of judgment. And if one, then two, it's a matter of judgment. Two, then three, it's a matter of judgment that a person has to make. I mean, you are going to have to make judgments relative to the law. I recall one young man I visited, his judgment relative to the Sabbath, since the Sabbath said you were supposed to rest, was that except for getting something to eat and going to the bathroom, he stayed in bed all day, 24 hours, round the clock. I don't think that was a very good way to make the Sabbath a delight. Number 11, are there some judgments that are relatively easy to make? Well, of course. I mean, a lot of things you'll come up against, you can decide. You yourself personally, you know what the Bible says. Your boss says that he wants you to work all day on the Sabbath day. That here comes a day. I've got to work all day long today. Is it an emergency? No, we just got to get this job done, and we want you down here. Well, that's a relatively easy judgment to make. If your mind is made up you're going to keep the Sabbath, you're not going to work. Now, it's a hard judgment to make, in a sense, if you have vacillated, or if you have not proved it, or if you're uncertain, or if you lack faith, it can become a rather difficult judgment. But it's your judgment that has to be made as to what you're going to do. And even though you make a judgment and you do what is wrong in a situation, say, I have to do it, you don't have to answer to me, or you don't have to answer to anybody else. The answering that will be done to God and to God alone. Fortunately for all of us, His mercy extends way out there. Number 12, are there some judgments that are too hard for some individuals to make? Now, if you reviewed Deuteronomy 17, verses 8 through 13, you'll see that there are hard judgments that come from time to time that we just don't feel like we can make. Sometimes these have to do with decisions we face in life. Sometimes they have to do with a conflict between us and another person, and that's the one that's described here, as to where we've got a difference of opinion between you and I relative to stroke and stroke, or plea and plea, or blood and blood, or something of this nature. Well, it's too hard. We have not been able to resolve it. So, we're supposed to do something about it. Number 13, if one needed help with a judgment, where and to whom could he go? Well, in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 17, there is this very clear thing laid out for us, that you can go to the priests, the Levites, the judges that should be in those days. You present your case to them. They ponder the matter. They give you a sentence or a decision. They show it to you out of the law. And when they show it to you out of the law, when that decision is rendered, that judgment is handed down, it takes on all the force of law. It is as powerful, is as strong as if it was written in the Ten Commandments. Serious. They lay down heavy penalties if you go contrary to this. Now, number 14, could a man make judgments for himself? Well, sure, if he doesn't consider the judgment too hard for him to make. So when you think about this, who decides if it's too hard for you? Well, you do, of course. So you can make judgments for yourself. Number 15, who decided if a matter of judgment was too hard for an individual to make? Well, the individual did. Number 16, what was the judge to use as the basis for his decision? Well, verse 11 answers that for you. It was the law of God. He couldn't make them up on his own. Number 17, was the judge allowed to make an arbitrary decision, or was he required to explain it? He was required to explain it. He had to teach it. He couldn't just say yes, no, you do this, you do that. He had to actually explain what it was and why he was doing it. Now, the truth is, probably just like law is today, a lot of judges' decisions, once rendered and explained, became a part of law, not merely for the two individuals concerned, but for others as well, in the sense that future decisions would rely on the decisions of previous judges as precedents. Nothing new about that. That's an old principle of law. Number 18, was a man allowed to ignore the decision of the judge if he didn't like it? Oh, no. Once that decision was made, it was binding. It kind of, in a way, if it's between two people, like binding arbitration. Now, I draw this note. In the Authorized Version, it is the word presumptuously. That is the attitude of the man who ignores the decision of the judges. Now, this is question number 19. How is it described? It's presumptuous. Now, the Hebrew word that's translated presumptuously, I don't know what it is in your translation, implies arrogance and insolence. It is not a question of ignorance or weakness or slipping aside or something of that nature. It's presumptuous, arrogant, insolence, ignoring of a decision rendered by judges. And it's really serious because there was no reason. If you didn't want to do what they said, you shouldn't have asked them in the first place. If you can't, in a community, a civilization, a society, if you can't have a judiciary whose decisions, once you go down and ask them, are binding, you don't have anything. You have anarchy. Number 20, was the decision and its implementation public knowledge? Oh, yes. It was not a matter that some people could go and do off in a corner somewhere. And you can see the importance of that in our courts today, that the things that are done cannot be done in secret. You can't trample all over a guy's rights and keep it secret from the public. It's got to be made known. Number 21, would the decision pass into law for others to do as well? Well, sure it would. Once a decision is made, it becomes a precedent. Now, there may be circumstances that arise that are like it, but not identical to it, in which case there would be a question of judgment as to whether this applies or this doesn't, and a person would either decide to do it or decide not to do it, or decide to go see a judge about it. Over time, a body of judicial decisions passes into the law of the land and advises future judges. It sets a precedent. No two cases are exactly alike, but the decision of one case may affect the outcome of another. A judgment is the application of law to a life situation. Remember that. You come into contact throughout the Old Testament with judgments, and while it may not be quite in the same terminology, you run into them in the New Testament as well. You apply the law of God to a life situation. Life situations change, and so consequently, judgments can change. The underlying law did not. Now, here's our question we're going to try to answer for you, is how did this work in practice in Old Testament times? Now we come to Exodus 18, which is a really fascinating example of the structure of justice and judgment and the way things were done. At the time of this incident, how many judges were there at the first? Well, one. Moses. And with all the people that were out there, can you imagine the frustration as people kept coming with decisions? You're in camp. I mean, a fight breaks out. You got to settle it somehow. And when there was no system of judges yet set up, when people were not established in place to make judgments on these, the confusion that could have resulted would have been, well, just staggering to say the least. So there was one. Number 23, when Moses sat to judge, hence the expression to sit in judgment, what were the standards by which he judged? Well, he judged by the law, of course. He had to judge and explain and teach from the law. The decisions he rendered were judgments, and they included explanations of the Torah and the statutes. Number 24, did Jethro think that what Moses was doing was efficient? Well, no, he didn't, and neither would I, and neither would you. I mean, it was terribly inefficient. Number 25, did God hand down the solution to this problem, or was it a humanly reasoned solution? Well, when you read through the account carefully, you find no revelation from God, nothing handed down from on high, no, oh Lord, what am I going to do about this situation? I'm frustrated with it. I don't know where to go with it. No. It's a humanly devised solution to a human problem. God seems not to have objected to it or not to have prevented it. And certainly it does seem to have worked better, at least in its earliest years, than it did as time went by. So God didn't hand it down. It was humanly reasoned. Number 26, were the judges in the new system necessarily priests or Levites? No, they were not. Now, I make the point that the system of judges set up at Jethro's suggestion was hierarchical in structure. Diagrammed on paper, it would form a pyramid. It worked. But was it the only way to resolve this problem? I think it's important to remember, God did not design this. He did not reveal it to Moses. It came from Jethro. God seems to have allowed considerable latitude in such matters of being people could make decisions for themselves. They could evaluate their problems. They could solve their problems. The problem, though, with the pyramid style is it leaves one man sitting on top of the pyramid. Was this the way God would always want it to work? Now we come to Numbers 11, and I'll ask you, perhaps you want to stop the tape and review that passage of Scripture to see what it is that it says, and remind yourself. Number 27. Was Moses at another time still overburdened? Yeah, he really was. I mean, problems like this don't go away. And in fact, you will oftentimes find that in a hierarchical structure, because of the way power is focused to the top, that people down the line in the hierarchical structure get nervous or antsy about their decisions, and they start handing up more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. And so that consequently, because the power is still focused on one person at the top, and the pyramid tends to focus it even more. Again, diagram the thing on paper, and you'll see how the power flows in that situation from bottom to top. So you'll understand that merely putting that kind of a system together does not necessarily solve your problem. So Moses was still overburdened. Number 28, who gave the solution this time? This time, God gave the solution. Now, number 29 is kind of a descriptive question. How did this solution differ from Jethro's? Well, it offered nothing in terms of a pyramid. There was no hierarchical structure. There was no captains of these numbers. Instead of having, let's say, 5 people report to Moses, or even 2, and then, let's say 10 people report to them, and 100 people report to them, and so on. It goes down the ladder of the thing. That this solution differed in that there were 70 elders selected to actually take care of judgmental things. And what's really important about this is what we're going to come to see in a moment. First of all, what sort of qualification did these elders have to meet? Well, they had to be elders or officers. In other words, they already were in positions that would have been recognized in the social structure of the time. They were what in the modern word probably you would call opinion leaders. They were influential people. Who selected them? Question number 31. Moses or God? Well, Moses selected them. Then comes perhaps the most important part about this. God empowered them to do their job. How did he do it? Question number 32. By giving them his Spirit. Now, it's really a remarkable coincidence between this and what happened at Pentecost. When all of the disciples are gathered together in one place, there comes this outpouring of the Holy Spirit. It comes through the ceiling. The fire sits on each one of them. They begin to speak in other tongues and prophesy. They were all empowered to do certain things, as all of the 70 were empowered to do these things under Moses. Now, it's really an interesting situation and a very different structure. Now, this is an important thing for us to understand, and we will look at more of it in other ways later on. Now, we come next to Matthew 23, verses 1 through 12. Here we have something of an acknowledgement of the structure of the Old Testament church government, as it were, and how it was working at the time when Jesus was carrying on his ministry. He said to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. The whole idea of sitting in judgment and having a seat of judgment is traced back to the old idea of sit to judge. And so what he's talking about here is that at this moment of time, the influential people in the different judgeships around the country were Pharisees. He said, now these scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. That is, that seat of judgment that was sort of handed down, as it were, from Moses, because all of those people in the pyramid, in Jethro's pyramid, could have been conceived of as sitting in Moses' seat, because they were reporting up the line in that way to Moses. Now, question number 33, did Moses' seat of judgment continue in the years of Jesus' ministry? Yes, it did. It was still there. Number 34, did Jesus recognize, at least for that time in that community, the authority of that seat? Yes, he did. If you went up to those judges and they rendered a decision, he said, you're supposed to do what that decision is because that's the community, this is the law, and you're supposed to do it. Number 35, as judges, were they corrupt? Oh, yes, they were. Sad to say. Jesus makes it very clear. Number 36, were the people to follow them in everything? Well, no. Just because you're a judge doesn't mean you can rule and judge on everything in sight. You only judge on the things that are brought to you. I mean, you can't sit up here in a local district court and decide without a suit even being brought that you don't like the way this is done or you don't like the way that is done, and start handing stuff down. You only judge on things that are brought to you. So no, they had no right to expect the people to follow them in everything, and Jesus certainly was not telling them that. The analogy of your local county courts that I have in the lesson here is applicable in this situation. Now, Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20. You might want to stop the tape and review for yourself what that passage of Scripture says. Number 37. In what way is the authority here granted to the apostles similar to that granted to the judges under Moses? Well, really, it's very, very similar in a sense. He said, whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. In other words, in the things that are brought to you, if you take them and you judge out of them and you show the people out of the Scriptures what's right and what's wrong, he said, I'm going to back you up in it. I'm going to actually make these decisions binding. Or if you say, no, this is not something you have to do, I'm going to let that decision go. They did not have the authority to change the law. They didn't have the authority to change what God's instructions were, to change Scriptures, to change the words of Jesus, to judge contrary to the words of Jesus. They would have had the responsibility, just like those old judges would have, of explaining what their decision was. And of course, they had no authority to be making a lot of decisions people weren't asking them about either. He actually was putting these men in a very similar situation to that granted the judges under Moses. They were the judiciary for the church. Number 38. Were the judicial decisions made by the apostles to take on full divine authority? Yes. Absolutely. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Now, I'm aware of all those other translations that tend to want, that are trying hard to get away from that. But you need to understand that what they're trying to do is to get away from the Catholic idea that whatever Peter says is binding for every Christian on the face of the earth, and Peter's successors, the popes, decide, carries that same authority. And so they want to say, no, they didn't have the authority to make all those decisions and so forth. Well, it doesn't even apply. It's not even in the ballpark, because this is just simply a New Testament expression of the principle of Deuteronomy 17 in the Old Testament. You don't judge on things that are brought to you, but when they are brought to you, they do take on full divine authority. Now, what follows is one type of the judicial process in the church, and it's based on Matthew 18, verses 15 through 20. Now, what happens in this section is that you have a dispute between you and your brother. The first thing you do is you try to work it out between the two of you. You don't want to go to court over things like this. You maybe pass a letter back and forth to each other. You get the issues clarified, and you try to arrive at some sort of a negotiated settlement between you before you do it. Now, then next time, if that doesn't work, it doesn't get anywhere, well, then you get this thing done together with witnesses so that everybody knows what it is that is said. What is the purpose, number 39, of taking 2 or 3 witnesses a second time you go to your brother about an offense? That is so that you can establish the fact that you told him what you told him. It's rather convenient for us nowadays to do these things by letter. Sometimes we use certified letters to even see to it that the thing got delivered and we can prove it got delivered. Now, number 40, is this passage referring to any kind of trespass or a particular kind of trespass or circumstance of trespass? Well, it's talking about a trespass against you. You don't have any business dragging your brother before witnesses and everything else about a trespass or some conflict that doesn't have anything to do with you. Number 41, is it indicated whether the 2 witnesses will exercise any judgment or make recommendations? Well, it says, if you'll not hear with you, take 2 or 3 witnesses, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established, and if he shall neglect to hear them. Now, the implication here is that the witnesses in this case are going to make recommendations. They're going to say, well, you ought not to do that. This is the way we think it ought to be. And if they won't, if that second step fails, number 42, before whom do the witnesses testify? Because they do. It says, if they shall neglect to hear them, tell it to the church. If they neglect to hear the church, let them be unto you as a heathen man and a publican. So on question 44, who then had the power of binding and loosing in such cases? Well, if you look back at the Matthew 16, people are prone to say that, well, Peter had the authority. In this context, it's the church that has the authority of binding and loosing. The assembly of God's people. Question number 45, with the church of 3,000 in Jerusalem, was it more likely that the whole church heard a case, or that a designated judge or judges heard it? Well, the answer to that shouldn't be that hard to figure out. Of course, they're bound to have had designated judges, and of course, most of that stuff went back up to the apostles, which is how they got into some of the difficulties they did by the time we come down to Acts 6 and the appointment of the first deacons and the first example of division of labor in the New Testament church, where you have a division between the ministry of the Word and the ministry of taking care of the people of the church. Number 46. Study carefully verses 19 and 20. Now, these are oftentimes abused. The idea is that if two of us get together and we agree to pray about this thing, we agree together on it, that God has to grant the request. Now, is this more likely to be talking about prayer requests or about rendering decisions in the church with divine backing? I think when you look at it, it's the latter, of course, that is what this passage of Scripture is about. Not so much the matter that anything two of us prayed about together is going to happen. We all individually have the promise of God that if we pray and ask, He will give us what we ask for. I know that group prayer or that praying together or asking other people to pray is a good thing. It's done and so forth. But I'm not at all sure that that's what this particular passage is about. Number 47, what was the effect of a man ignoring the judgments of the assembly? Well, he was treated as though he were not a member of the assembly anymore. In a sense, he was sort of cut off from the assembly. Number 48, would one speak to or associate with a publican? Well, yes, of course you would. Jesus did. He had him in his house, so that's not the problem. Number 49, did one trust a publican or a heathen as one might a brother? Well, no. Obviously, you have come to the place where this person has betrayed the trust. He won't hear, he won't do the judgment of the church, and therefore he can't be considered a member of the church any longer. Now, then we come to number 50. What then was the effect of treating a man as a heathen or a publican? Well, you treated him like your next door neighbor if he's not a member of the assembly of God's church. Now, this has certain implications relative to another policy or another procedure that the church had. This is the time to stop the tape and refresh your memory on 1 Corinthians 6, 1 through 8. Number 51, should a member of the church take a brother to court? No. Very explicitly, we're not supposed to be doing that kind of thing. Number 52, are we as converted people allowed or even expected to judge in some circumstances? Yes. You know, I know that the Bible says, judge not that you be not judged. It basically is talking about condemning people when it's not really your job to be doing so. But the fact of the matter is you have to be able to judge. And so they were supposed to judge in certain circumstances. Number 53, is there any suggestion here that it is wrong to go to court with an unbeliever, a heathen, if you will? No, there's no suggestion of that. What it does suggest is that there ought to be a judiciary in the church, formal or informal, in which matters of dispute between brothers are heard and they are settled out of court by binding arbitration in the church. And if that binding arbitration is not recognized, we treat him as an unbeliever, as a heathen, which means you have the right to take him to court, if that's what you have to do. Now, number 54, what sort of person would the assembly designate to hear a case? Well, obviously, a person wise, knowledgeable in the Bible, a person unbiased. Number 55, in a case where a man has caused great monetary loss to a brother and refuses to hear the church, does the brother have no other recourse? Is he just going to go sit there? Or, if he's been made into one like a heathen man and a publican, and you can sue them, why can't you sue him? Number 56. If a man who will not hear the church is to be treated as a heathen man and a publican, does this mean that one might now seek redress in court? Now, I think a circumstance like this would be very rare, especially in small assemblies. Most grievances can be settled on the first visit, most of the remainder on the second. All that I'm including is this here for is to demonstrate the process of rendering judgments was a part of the life of Israel of old and a part of the life of the New Testament church, and that you weren't supposed to be going to the ordinary courts for these things, but to going to your brothers and the judiciary inside the church to take care of these things. Nowadays, the judiciary in the church and the way the judiciary in the church works is much more on an informal basis. You go to someone you trust or you go to the ministry, and most of those things are sorted out. I can't recall a case in all my years of the ministry where there was ever any necessity of somebody later on going to court over something they had taken to the ministry. Now under the heading, the chief judge. Number 57. Moses was the one at the top of Jethro's pyramid. Who is the one at the top for the church? Well, if you looked up the Scriptures concern, you probably didn't have to look up the Scriptures concern. You know the one that's at the top of the pyramid for the church is Jesus Christ, right? That can be no other. Was there, number 58, to come another prophet like Moses? Well, yes, there was. Deuteronomy 18:15-19 describes that. Who fulfilled that prophecy, number 59? Well, Peter gives the answer in Acts 3 that Christ is the one who fulfilled that prophecy. So Christ is Moses to the church in that sense. No human being and no human leader can fulfill that office. Now you may want to stop the tape and review Matthew 20, verses 20 through 28. Number 60, what were the presumptions of the disciples relative to the structure of Jesus' administration? Well, they seem to have assumed that it was going to be hierarchical, with one on his right, one on his left, and then the power being transmitted on down from those other people. Number 61, was Jesus prepared to allow authoritarian rule in his kingdom or his church? No. This entire description absolutely rules out authoritarian rule in the church. Number 62, is there any hint that Jesus was prepared to have under himself one man hierarchical rule over the whole church? If it's convenient for you, I ask you to take a look in your dictionary at the meaning of hierarchy. And the truth is, that's what you got. You have one person at the top and everybody else under him, and there's just no way that you can have that kind of a structure with one man under Christ, one person in authority. That's not what Jesus is describing. Now, returning to the Old Testament, how did judging actually work in practice? And this is a rather interesting thing to, I think, to consider, because it's once we begin to understand how judging worked, how judgments were arrived at, and the implications of judgments, the method of dealing with the Old Testament law really becomes a relatively simple process. So let's stop for a moment and take a look at Numbers 15, verses 22 through 36. Number 63, is there such a thing as a sin of error or ignorance? Well, yes, there is. In fact, most of the sins we commit fall in that category. We didn't understand, we didn't grasp it, we made a mistake, it was an error, we didn't intend it. Most of it falls in that category. Number 64, is there such a thing as presumptuous or arrogant sin? Well, obviously there is, and in the Bible, as they work their way through this, that sort of thing becomes very apparent. Now, number 65, would you expect sins of error or ignorance to be dealt with in the same way that arrogant or presumptuous sins would be dealt with? Well, I'll put it another way, would you as a judge deal with them in the same way? I certainly would not. Number 66, was this instance of gathering sticks on the Sabbath a sin of error or a presumptuous sin? Well, it's in the context, fairly plainly, of a presumptuous sin. I mean, this was not an awkward situation. This wasn't a situation where all of a sudden a blue norther had come through and nobody had any firewood. We're in a rather stable climate. People really knew what was coming down. And so this guy, we are told, was out there in a presumptuous sin. Now, number 67, was it clear to Moses and the other judges what should be done? No, it really wasn't clear. Number 68, who rendered the judgment in this case? God did. Now, as I point out to you, it's worth noticing that this particular example does not fall in a historical account, but in the middle of a set of laws. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that it's offered, as judgments commonly are, as an example of what to do with a given law under specific circumstances. In this case, it's an illustration of a presumptuous sin and how its treatment might differ from the treatment of an ignorant sin, or a weak sin, or a confusion sin, which sometimes happens. Number 70, might there be a difference in the administration of judgments when one does not live in a society governed by God? Well, yeah, there certainly would be. For example, we don't live in a society today where we would have the right to administer the death penalty to some guy for going out and gathering sticks on the Sabbath. So if you're in a theocracy, as people like to call it, which basically means God-governed community or society, where the entire structure of it from top to bottom is all theologically based and based on the law of God administered by the servants of God, you have one set of circumstances. Nehemiah, for example, governing the city of Jerusalem as a man of God, had a different set of circumstances for keeping the Sabbath than you do living in Austin, Texas, or Amarillo, Texas, or Chicago, Illinois do in keeping the Sabbath in a city that you don't govern, nor is it governed by anybody who believes in, knows, or follows God's laws. So the judgments that are made in those kinds of circumstances are certainly going to be different in certain kinds of situations. I think I may have slipped over number 69 here. Can you think of instances where the same act might be committed but with a different attitude and intent and where a different judgment might be made? I can, without any trouble whatsoever. I can consider the fact that a man has gone and set up camp somewhere, and he and his family have settled down, and they think they have enough firewood. But when the blue norther comes rolling through there and a sudden weather change takes place and the temperature drops and they've got a child in the tent and they're concerned about the child dying, they go out and gather sticks on the Sabbath and build a fire to keep everybody warm. This makes a lot of sense to me, and I would not arrive at the same judgment in that case as I would out here in the Sinai Peninsula, where everybody's known all week that they were supposed to have their firewood ready for the Sabbath day, and one guy doesn't and goes out and gathers sticks. It's just thumbs his nose at everybody, says, I don't care what you're saying, I'm going to do what I want to do. So, yeah, a different judgment might be made in that circumstance. Number 71. Does the fact that a different judgment might be made in other circumstances mean that this judgment is abolished? Well, of course not. The judgment is there. It's a part of the law. It defines how the law applies to a life situation. Presumptuous sin is dealt with severely by God, and I think it's worth bearing in mind. It also underlines once again for us the principle of the preparation for the Sabbath. Get the stuff ready ahead of time so you don't have to do it on the Sabbath day. Number 72. Does this judgment teach us anything about the application of the fourth commandment or its judgment? Well, it certainly does. It teaches us that the preparation day should be observed, that we should gather our wood on Friday, and the Sabbath is important enough, that the presumptuous sin relative to the Sabbath is important enough, that the death penalty would be applied in that kind of circumstances. Now, make note, a judgment once rendered becomes a permanent part of law. This law did not require Israel to have Sabbath police or to stone everyone who picked up 2 sticks of firewood on the Sabbath day from that day on. Exceptions could have been made for emergency or hardship, but the law served to illustrate that for a community to have any discipline, high-handed, flagrant sin had to be dealt with by the community. In this case, there were 2 problems. One was the breaking of the Sabbath, and the other a deliberate flouting of the commandments of God and the leadership of Moses. It's important to review, I think, at the bottom of the page here below Numbers 15, verses 22 through 36, under the notes, that a great deal of Old Testament law, more than you might think, is in the form of judgments. As I point out, Israel had lived a long time by the time Deuteronomy was written, and a lot of things had been judged and evaluated either by God or by the people and had been put down in writing as a part of the continuing law of Israel. And these judgments have to be considered. They don't always have an application that you and I can do anything about in the 20th century, but they're there for us to know, to understand, to evaluate, and to meditate on so that we will understand what God's intent is and may be able to apply it in some way in our own life. Now follows an exercise in biblical judgments based on Deuteronomy 22, verses 1 through 30. So you might stop the tape and read along here and kind of keep your mind on what the Scripture is saying. Number 73. Does the old law, finders, keepers, losers, weepers, find any support in God's law? The old saying. The answer is no, it doesn't find any support in it. What it says is that if you find something, you are responsible to the owner. Just because somebody lost it doesn't mean it's not his property anymore. That's the lesson that's contained in this law. That's the underlying principle of the law, that you can take some of these laws and apply. Number 74, verses 1 through 3 contain judgments applying to specific instances. Write for yourself a short paragraph describing the underlying principle of this passage of the law. Well, the underlying principle involved in it is, I think simply stated, is just because a man's lost some of his property doesn't mean it's not his anymore. It basically means that you are responsible for your neighbor's property. And if he's lost something and you know it's his, you take it to him and you're responsible for it. You can't just shut your eyes to it and ignore the fact that the animal or whatever it is out there. Number 75, can you suggest a modern incident in an urban environment which would be covered by the underlying law, though not specifically mentioned here? Well, I can very specifically remember a situation where I was driving along a road and here came my neighbor's dog. I know the dog. I mean, it goes walking with us occasionally. We don't intend to take it walking. It just goes with us occasionally. I'm out on another road way off somewhere else, and I find the dog over there. So it's out. It's gotten out. The owners didn't intend for it to be out. I stop, open the door, let the dog in, take the dog home, knock on the door of my neighbor and says, by the way, did you lose a dog? Oh, yes. Well, we restored the dog to it. So that's my explanation. Yours may be different from that, but I bet you will have very little difficulty in finding something like that. Number 76, your neighbor, whom you don't like very much, has gone off and left his sprinkler on. The water is gathering and is about to run into an area that will cause some costly damage to your neighbor. The handle that will turn it off is in plain view. It's a few steps away. Should you turn it off, step across the line there, go over to his house, turn it off, or should you let it run and damage his property? Well, obviously, you should go over and turn it off. Which judgment in this chapter would apply? Well, more than one may work. I'll let you be the judge of whether yours does or not, but verse 4 certainly does, that you're not to see your brother's axe or his ox or his ass fall down by the way and not help him. In other words, you have a responsibility to pitch in and help out your neighbor and to try to prevent your neighbor from suffering financial loss. And to me, if someone asked me, was it right for him to go do that or right for him not to, I'd say he should have done it because of and this is the principle, if we need to go back and find a principle to that effect. Number 77, does the law prohibit cross-dressing? Well, yes, it does. Verse 5 of this passage very specifically forbids it. Number 78, what might be the underlying purpose of this law? Well, I don't know what your conclusion will be on this, and I'll give you a great deal of latitude on it, but essentially what I see in it is the fact that God intends to maintain sexual identities between people. He doesn't want people confusing children about who they are, for one thing. Mama should look like mama, and dad should look like dad. And so should uncles and aunts and so forth and so on. That the society should have a clear delineation between men and women, and cross-dressing, women wearing men's clothing and men wearing women's clothing, is a confusing thing in that regard, and it could have an effect on children, not to mention the effect on the people who are actually doing it. In any case, God says people who do that are an abomination to God. Now, number 79, in your judgment, would the underlying purpose of this law prohibit a woman from wearing her husband's parka to the grocery store? His is hanging by the door, his is down, hers is in the closet, and it's Dacron or polyfill, and his is warmer and it's really cold outside. Would you, as a judge, say that it was wrong for her to wear her husband's parka? Well, I certainly would not. The principle of this law has nothing to do, the difference between a man's parka and a woman's parka may be what color they are, and very little else that would be considered in the process. So no, there's nothing wrong with her wearing her husband's parka to the grocery store. Number 80. And this is really an interesting question. Where does the Bible define, quote, that which pertains to a man, end quote, in the way of clothing? Well, it doesn't. Number 81. If the Bible does not define it, what does? Answer, society does. We know what women's clothes looks like, and we know what men's clothes. It's getting harder to know, I would say that nowadays. But most of us are aware of that and have little difficulty with it. Number 82. What is the underlying concept expressed by the judgments of verses 6 and 7? Well, very few of us will ever have necessarily occasion to run across a dam sitting on eggs or a bird in the field or so forth at all. But the underlying concept is of conservation, to give attention to it. It's environmentalism, it's called today, and some of the environmentalism gets a little strange, but the underlying principle which we were taught in school when I was growing up, and the environmentalism was never brought up, but conservation was the word, and the idea of conservation of the environment is right. And you hurt yourself, you hurt other generations if you're not careful with the wildlife in your area. So that's a fairly simple one to render a judgment on, isn't it? Number 83, can you think of a different illustration of the same principle? I won't try to give you anything specific here and let you judge your own on the basis of what we've discussed up until this time. But any number of illustrations of conservation of the environment certainly would be applicable in this type of situation. Number 84. Verse 8 has a very specific requirement. In your judgment, how would it apply to a man building a house with a pitched roof in a modern community where no one but workers will ever be on his roof? Now, it would look silly, wouldn't it, to wander through the neighborhood seeing all these houses and then come to your house and to see a battlement built up around the edge of the roof. It does not seem to me that type of a requirement would apply to that kind of a roof. You have to understand, the old days, people built houses with flat roofs. There was an internal access to the roof. They spent a lot of time on the roof. They slept up there in hot weather. because it was cooler up there at night than it was down inside the house. And no one wanted anybody falling off the edges of it. So verse 8 really is an expression of the law of liability. That you create a hazard, you're liable for it. You need to protect people from hazards. Number 85. Suppose a man builds a deck behind his house that is high on a slope at the back. A person could fall from this deck and be hurt. Is he not bound by the law because the law does not mention a deck? So I don't bother the law says nothing about a deck. I'm not putting no barricade around my deck. And some kids get out there, some visitors come to see me and their children are on the deck, and somebody falls off my deck, which is about 8 feet high from the ground in the back. Kid gets hurt, breaks his arm. Am I liable? You bet I'm liable. I'm liable by biblical law. I'm liable by modern law. I'm liable by all kinds of things because I didn't put that up there. But the fact is, the principle of this law in verse 8 covers creation of a hazard of falling, which can be applied in a lot of different directions to people and to circumstances on your property. Number 86, describe in a short paragraph the underlying principle behind this judgment. Your paragraph should basically say that you are liable for hazards that you create on your property, and you should take steps to protect visitors and family members from those hazards. Verses 9 through 11 seem to be related. How would you describe the underlying principle? The underlying principle of this law seems to have to do with not adulterating things, that is, not watering them down or cheapening things. That when you're going to go with a suit, get an all-wool suit. Go 100%. Certainly it would preclude adulterating things that you're going to sell to somebody else. But I think beyond that, I think it tells a person to be 100%er in your own life and to go the quality route in as much as you can. I don't think it would forbid the use of woolen dacron or things of that nature, because oftentimes we may want to choose a particular fabric mix because it wears better for travel. It doesn't wrinkle as badly. This law doesn't take into consideration a situation. For example, our society, in one sense of the word, recognizes this by requiring manufacturers to tell you what's in the suit. They can't sell you a suit pretending that it's all wool while it's wool and dacron. They have broken the law. So, to some small extent, this law has found expression in the modern world in our own society. The note on question number 87 will give you all you need to evaluate your answer. Number 88. What was to be done to a man who went around grumbling that his wife was not a virgin when he married her, if it turned out the charges were false? Well, he had to keep her his wife, and he couldn't put her away all of his days. The law allowed, in some circumstances, a divorce at later time, but this guy he can't divorce her at all. She is his wife for now and forever. Number 89, was virginity at marriage a serious matter? Oh, my word, yes, it was. In that time, it was a very serious matter. Note nowadays, it ought to be a serious matter today, but it's gotten to the place to where it seems like it's not to many people. The tokens of virginity were a custom of the time that could be incorporated into a judgment. Nowadays, there are no tokens of virginity, so there's no way on earth that you could incorporate this into a judgment. You not only don't have the set of judges, but the particular thing you don't have is tokens of virginity as a fundamental thing of society. Apparently, what this was they put a sheet under her on her wedding night, and the blood that resulted from her having the hymen broken was on the sheet, and they could bring the sheet out and show, here's the proof that she was a virgin when she got married. Nothing like that exists today. So how could you provide this particular law? I have no idea. Of course, it's possible to bring some form of testimony that she was not a virgin. I know of no way of proving that a woman was a virgin except for the testimony of her and of her husband about their wedding night nowadays, which would be an awkward situation. The remainder of the examples in this chapter I left for you to explore on your own. And then question number 90. Now can you understand why David found meditation on the law so profitable? I hope your answer is yes. Because the fact is that when you read these things and you spend some time thinking on them, maybe even a little time reading up on them, maybe check a commentary or go down to the library and look something up, there are in fact some rather interesting things about this law having to do with fringes and fringes of blue on the edges of a person's garment related to the customs of the time. But I think I'll leave it for you to research those things and see what you can find on it. If having looked for it for a while you fail, drop me a line. I think I have a research paper back in my background somewhere that I can dig up and send to you. And so, summarizing though the point of this particular lesson,
is that one of the most important things for you to know about the law is that it is full of judgments. We're not talking now, though, about the oral law. We're talking about the written law. For many judgments, I'm sure, in ages gone by, formed a part of the oral law and never made their way into the canon of the Bible or into written law. The rules and regulations, for example, of the calendar would fall under that category. But many, many judgments did find their way into it. They are applications of the law to life situations. And you're entitled to judge, to evaluate, to weigh, to think, to use reason, to use common sense, to ask yourself, how does this law apply to life? And the meditation on the law, the thinking about the law, will bring many things to your mind of ways in which you can be more careful relative to your neighbor, be more responsible relative to your neighbor. Will help you to understand more about God and what God is doing and why He is doing it and what His mind is and how it works. That you can grow to understand these things by the law. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about Jesus, His judgments relative to the law, and how He looked at the law of the Old Testament. For now, that's all we have. I hope you continue to enjoy your study.